As you well know, this is far from the first time that unrest has broken out in response to the killings of black Americans, nor is this the first time politicians have promised to do something about it. As Boston Globe columnist Janae Osterholt put it, America has bad credit in paying off promises. So, will this time be any different? My next guest was the president and CEO of the NAACP when police officers killed Eric Garner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and many others. Cornell William Brooks is now the founding director of the Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Center for Public Leadership, as well as a professor in the school. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Good to be with you.
So on our radio show today, we asked callers, what took white people so long to join the movement? There were many George Floyds, as I just mentioned, and for that matter, Amy Coopers before there was George Floyd and Amy Cooper. What did take us so long, assuming that you believe that we're finally getting there?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with, as Americans, this tendency to want to believe the best about ourselves and the best about our country, in spite of facts to the contrary. And so you hear this occasionally, or actually quite often. People will say that bad policing is a matter of a few bad apples, a few aberrational officers. And so that view of policing as a matter of a few misguided officers as opposed to an industry which is infected by systemic racism has led many people to blink the facts. And so we are at a moment, however, when many people are beginning to come face to face with the reality that American policing brutalizes black and brown communities.
You know, I'm a former lawyer, not much of one, but I was a lawyer. But I never believed that law changes are the most important things. They're important, but that mind changes have to go hand in hand or you really don't get anywhere. What is the single most important thing that has to change in this country for the relationship between law enforcement and black Americans to change?
Well, fundamentally, American policing has to change from top to bottom. Let's begin with the facts. When police homicide is the sixth leading cause of death among young black men, when a black man knows that out of every 1,000 black men, one will be killed at the hands of the young black men, are 21 times more likely to lose their lives at the hands of the police. In order to change the scope and sweep of that brutality, it means that policing must change from top to bottom. And that begins first with looking at the standard for an excessive use of force. So in other words, where there isn't truly a national standard, where the presumption is when an officer determines that his life is threatened reasonably, subjectively, they can literally kill a person. We've got to change the standard. This notion of using chokeholds, discharging your weapon after fleeing vehicles. But fundamentally, it comes down to changing the culture of policing, which is to say that we cannot have a situation where black people literally regarded as the objects of suspicion as opposed to the subjects of protection. And that goes to like literally changing the entire culture. And that is not a matter of tinkering around the edges.
Speaking of change, I assume you agree that it's not just about police brutality. Things like economic and health brutality have come into clear focus in the last few months for most Americans. And a question that all Americans are going to face come November, is Joe Biden the man to lead this country away from this behavior? Governor Deval Patrick was with me the other night, and I asked Governor Patrick if he believed Joe Biden, who he has endorsed, is a man of bold ideas, and here's what Governor Patrick had to say.
Joe Biden might be exactly what we need. His empathy is legendary, and it's real. What we need around him are folks who are going to push him from a policy point of view. And I think that's what an awful lot of us are trying to do right now.
So the governor says we need people to push him to get to the right place. And then I read your comments in the Washington Post after a speech on race from Joe Biden, and I have to say, I saw them as pretty tepid in support. Not what he said perfectly, it's what he tried to say. You didn't like when he said it would take a generation to deal with systemic racism. Is this man the man with bold enough ideas to fix what ails this country?
Here's what I believe. I agree with Governor Patrick that Joe Biden has a deep and sincere heart with respect to empathy. He comes or will come to the presidency, I believe, at a moment that calls for boldness. He has a generation of demonstrators and activists around him who are calling for bold ideas. He has a country that is on the precipice of a movement. And so the point being here is I believe that Joe Biden will step into the gap. So it may not be his inclination. It may not be his disposition to rush forward with bold ideas, but that's what the moment calls for. In the same way that LBJ may not have wanted to embrace civil rights, or John Kennedy wanted to embrace civil rights, but the times called for it. And I believe that Joe Biden, based upon his leadership under President Barack Obama, will do so. And that's not a tepid endorsement. That's an accurate assessment.
I want to stay with him just for a second, if I may. I think it's a fair assessment to say that he is the Democratic nominee because of a guy I think you're doing an event with tomorrow night, the highest-ranking African-American in the Congress, Jim Clyburn, and black voters in South Carolina. So unlike, at least in my opinion, so many Democrats who've come before, what does candidate Biden need to do to show that he doesn't just talk the talk, but he actually is willing and able to walk the walk and understand what black voters are supporting him for?
Well, let's be clear. Because I'm from South Carolina, Congressman Clyburn is a family friend. I'm from the same part of the state that supported him so strongly, supported Vice President Biden so strongly. So here's what I would note. Vice President Biden needs to do what he has done, which he showed up. When I served as president and CEO of the NAACP, he showed up. He put forward policies that spoke to the needs, the aspirations of black people. He needs to point to his record under President Barack Obama and then extrapolate forward what he plans to do as president. If he does that, he will be the president of the United States. He will beat Donald John Trump, but he's got to do so projecting forward, not merely looking backward, articulating a clear vision for the country, and then recognizing that this moment is not a moment that was present during the presidency of Barack Obama. This is a different moment.
Does he need to pick a black woman to be his running mate?
He doesn't need to pick a black woman to be his running mate, but he should pick a black woman to be his running mate. Why? Because African-American women have been the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party. And let us note this, there is a multiplicity of well-qualified African-American women who are fit to serve, who are prepared to serve as Vice President of the United States. And this is the moment to do so.
You know, before you go, before you were on this show, I was joined by Mayor Walsh of Boston, and we talked about how he recently said that he believed Boston should be leading the fight against racism in this country. And I mentioned to him that a day or two after that happened, a report from 2019 came out talking about stop and frisk numbers in Boston, where black people in the city disproportionately stopped and questioned. Yesterday, we learned about a sports broadcaster who left town years ago because of what she and her husband perceived as racism. A few days ago, a baseball player talked about how the N-word was showered on him anytime he came to town. You spend time here now. Is Boston the right place to be leading this charge?
Is Boston the right place to be leading the charge? Absolutely. I was educated in Boston, as was my spiritual mentor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at Boston University School of Theology. I teach at Kennedy School. You do not lead simply because you're in the front. You lead with a determination to lead, which is to say Boston has a legacy of leadership when it comes to civil rights, going back to the days of the abolitionists. And so we're going back to the days of William Monroe Trotter. The point being here, it's not a matter of having a blemish-free past or a sin-free past in terms of racism. It's a matter of our resolve, our commitment, our determination to lead. That's what makes a city a leader. Atlanta, in many ways, has led with respect to race relations, going back to the 60s. But it's not because Atlanta was a city free of racism. It was a city committed to being on the forefront. If Boston does that, in word and deed, it can.
Cornell William Brooks, pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's good to be with you.
The NAACP convention, by the way, was scheduled to come to Boston this summer, but will now be held online.